Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mass Communication 310. This video will be going over the power of visuals. And for part one, we'll be discussing photography, while in part two, we will be discussing illustrations and how we can utilize those within our graphic design and layout to tell stories more effectively. Now, visuals are a very important part of design. In fact, when you are looking at a design piece, whether that's a flyer, an advertisement, a newsletter, the first thing that the eye is trained to see is visuals, whether those are photography or illustrations. They really help break up the text and tell a story in a unique way. And so it's important that we understand how to utilize visuals in a meaningful way. For a lot of design, visuals are the core component. In fact, there are many types of advertising and other types of design that really rely on visuals alone and don't use things like text and color, as we've discussed in previous chapters. So, understanding the right ways to use photographs and illustrations is an important part of building up your graphic design experience. Now, photography is one of the primary ways to use visuals within graphic design. Photography allows us to tell stories without words because a photograph really can share more meaning. It can tell the story, it can let your audience know about your mood or a feeling a lot more effectively than text can. And so, by pairing good photography with text and layout and other types of color and design elements, what you're really doing is centering your design around your photograph. And there are many ways to use photography in design. One of the primary ways is to sell products or to display products or an organization and its brand. So, for example, anytime that you see something for sale, you will notice that it is much more common for them to actually take a photo of the product so that you know what you're getting. And really, the more details that the photo provides about the product, the better, which is why a lot of companies are using 360. Even Target within their app is using augmented reality. So you can see a photo of the product and then place it in the environment that you are hoping to place that product in. So, using photography to sell products is a major part of advertising and sales, but it can also really help you to be able to sell products in terms of nonprofits or public relations by showing people what you do and what your organization is known for. In a similar vein, using photography to establish trust with your audience can be done by showing your team. You can show your audience other clients that have used your products to establish trust. You can add more and more details about your organization or your project so that the more details that they see, the more credible you and your messaging become. Another way to use photography is to create an ideal world by placing your product or organization in this kind of dreamlike vision of what your audience could receive if they take use of your product or project. So, for example, you'll notice that in catalogs for furniture companies or things of that nature, you always see, that couch that they want to sell you placed in a highly stylized apartment, that it all looks cohesive and everything matches. And the idea is that your audience is going to think, well, if I buy this couch, then my living room is going to look like this. Well, we all know, on a intellectual level that that's not true. And yet, when we see an image, we can really better picture what our ideal world is and how that product can play a part in creating that ideal world for us at home. This is why using products to really showcase what the world could be like if our audience uses our products or services is an important part of design. You can also tell stories, which is a large reason that photojournalists pair photographs within their articles and layouts. In fact, in the digital storytelling age, it's nearly impossible to tell a story without some type of visual in order to help your audience better understand what you're saying. More multimedia allow your audience to be more immersed within your storytelling. So, the more photographs you can provide in your storytelling, really the better. You can also teach techniques by taking photos of how to's and showing and demonstrating how to use your product, or in a manual type situation, you can take photos as well. And those can be particularly helpful when you're doing how to or manual designs. Now, there are three ways to really get good photographs for graphic design. The first is to take the picture yourself. And in fact, within this class, that's really what I want us to do in order to practice how we can be do it yourself photographers. You can also hire a professional photographer, and many organizations and companies do this for large campaigns. The downside, of course, is that professional photographers cost a lot of money, and you lose some control over the end product by hiring someone else to do that. A cheaper version to get photographs that are high quality is to use stock images. And stock images are those that are either free or royalty free after purchase. And stock images really allow you to search a database of images available, usually for purchase of a smaller fee than what a professional photograph would be. But the downside is that the stock images are typically less, uh, they do not actually serve the purpose that you need. You're going to have to find something that's close enough. So let's look at how we can do our own photography in a better, more professional way. One of the key elements of taking photographs is the use of light. And this really distinguishes, you using your phone and taking a selfie from being more professional and being able to utilize photos for your design and campaigns. So, in order to get good light, the first thing you should always try to do is use natural light. The light that we get from outdoor sunlight is much better than artificial light because it tends to mimic the colors of the world around us. So, the more you can play up the use of natural light, as you see in the left hand photo, where you have a window that's shining light in, and then you're using a reflector to make sure that the light is bouncing off of that reflector onto your product. So your product is nice and bright and light. This allows you to create more of a home studio type feel. Now, a home studio does not have to be very expensive. This is a similar setup to what I have on the right hand side when I take photos at home. I have a small lighting unit that I got off of Amazon for $20-$30. I use a bounce board, which is really just allowing the light to reflect back onto the product. I use a white t-shirt to cover my lighting unit so that it's a little bit softer. You use a white tabletop or white cover below the product, and make sure that your background is white as well. Having your products surrounded by light, and particularly white backdrops, really allows the element that you're trying to show off within your photography pop. And so if you are using photography in order to showcase a particular product or person, having this kind of home studio is actually very helpful. You can even use this with people. This is the type of home studio that we have when we are taking headshots for people. We actually use a green screen within our home studio, which is really just a green backdrop that allows us to edit in any background that we need. But having a white backdrop is also really great. You can have a lighting umbrella like you see here, a reflector that you see on the left-hand side. Make sure that you're using a tripod when you are creating uh, do-it-yourself photography so that you have nice stability and that everything is level. Now, again, a home setup that looks like this could be anywhere from $50 to $100. But if you are doing photography for your design and layout regularly, it can be worth it in order to do it. Now, when we are talking about do it yourself photography, you want to consider what kind of camera you want to use. For most projects, a cell phone camera is going to be good enough. For the most part, uh, particularly for iPhones and other types of newer Android devices, the lenses that are on your phone are similar to the ones that would be in a DSLR camera. The difference is that a DSLR camera allows for manual adjusting, where cell phones don't allow you as much control. However, you could download a camera app that allows you more control over the types of photographs that you're using, as opposed to just opening up your camera on your phone generally. So these are all things that you can consider, but you can absolutely take a good enough photo for most of your projects on a newer, within the past, 3 to 5 years cell phone device. Now, when we're talking about do it yourself photography, there are really a few definitions that you need to know, particularly when you are manually adjusting with the DSLR camera. When you're working with designers, knowing these kinds of terms will help you to better communicate with them. And also, when you're hiring a professional photographer, if you know these design definitions, it really allows you to communicate what the goals for your photograph are. So the first one is shutter speed. The shutter is the part of the camera that opens in order to let light in. When you use a shutter speed, you are measuring in fractions of a second how long the shutter takes to open and close. If you have good light, so you have a nice bright area with a lot of natural light, you're going to want to use a fast shutter speed, which allows you to have sharp images. But if you have lower light, if it's darker, it's nighttime, then you're going to be using a slower shutter speed. The slower shutter speed will allow you to get enough light in, but the downside is that your images are going to appear slightly blurry. The second definition that I want you to know for photography is aperture, or what's called an F number. An F number indicates the size of the hole that the shutter makes when the shutter is open. And really, what the F number will tell you is how much of the image is in focus. So, when you have a large F number, a larger area of the photo is in focus, as you can see on the farthest right picture. When you have a smaller F number, only the subject is sharp. So when you're using portrait mode on an iPhone, what you're really doing is using a smaller F number that makes the subject that's up front in focus, but the background is blurred. An ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light. If you are taking photos with a higher ISO, it means that you are more light sensitive and you can take pictures with lower light. This allows you to take nighttime photos or photos that are indoors without a lot of natural light. But when you're using a high ISO, it can lead to grainy and poor quality images because it's taking in too much light. So you're really wanting to find a medium level ISO where you have enough natural light, where your images are not grainy and poor quality, but they are also not as dark as you would see on a low ISO. Now, in terms of composing photos, one of the major rules that you need to know is the rule of thirds. This is a rule that we use within videography as well. So, if you've taken classes within broadcasting, you're familiar with this, but we also see this used within photographs as well.
Today we're going to talk about composition. At its very basic level, composition is about where you place your subject in the frame. It's how you compose your shot. There are lots of ways to frame up a shot, but what makes some images look better than others? Good composition requires more than a camera and a pretty background. It truly is an art, and if done properly, will ensure that your stories stand out. It will give them energy and make them more interesting, more memorable. There are some excellent guidelines for improving composition, guidelines that have been proven over centuries of great paintings, then photography, and now film and video. Today, we're going to talk about the rule of thirds. Most beginning videographers place their subject in the center of the frame. And when shooting landscapes, they put the horizon line right down the middle of the shot, cutting the picture in half. They do it without thinking. The results? Well, the shots look kind of boring. Instead, try placing your subject just off center and balance them with the other elements in the frame. Imagine a grid like this one. Can you see where the lines intersect? The rule of thirds suggests that if you place your subject on these intersecting points, or on the horizontal or vertical lines, your shot becomes much more balanced. It's more natural for the human eye to move to the thirds of the frame rather than the center. Let's take this mountain, for example. This is what it would look like if I framed it in the center. But instead, let's move the mountain to one of the intersecting points. See how the shot is more interesting and engaging? Here, the horizon line is right down the center of the frame. Instead, let's use the rule of thirds as our guide and place the horizon on one of the two horizontal lines. In this case, we would emphasize the sky, and in this case, we'd emphasize the mountains. In the same way, we can use the vertical lines as a guide for framing. This is my cat, Cheetah Louise. So instead of framing her in the center of the frame, I'm going to want to put her on one of the vertical lines. Here are some more examples, using the rule of thirds as a guide to framing.
Tequila, I'm Tequila. Who loves me? Nobody. They gave me a name, AIDS. Why?
One way to improve your composition is to study movies and photos taken by great photographers. Think about where your eye is drawn in the photo and what makes the picture appealing to you. And then get out there and practice. Spend an entire day just focusing on making your frames of video engaging and powerful.
So, whether you're using the rule of thirds for videography or for photography, it is a very useful way to compose your photos in a way that is meaningful and eye catching for your audience. Now, other ideas for composing your photos: make sure that the composition of your photo is fitting the format to the subject. So you always want the subject to be the primary focus of your composition. The subject of your photo should be placed on the rule of thirds, as we just saw, but it also needs to be the sharpest, most in focus, and make sure that it is the most eye-catching of your photo and nothing else is too distracting around your subject. You want to consider the background as well. Do you need to have a plain background that would allow your subject to stand out? Do you want your subject to be against a busier background to have contrast? So, really think about what kind of background would fit the format of your photo and your design best. The other thing you can do is use lines to lead the eye of your viewer. Here I've included two examples on the right-hand side of the slide where we're using lines that show motion in the same way as our subject. So if our subject is the bicyclist that we see in the top photo, we want all of the lines of the photo to really draw our eye towards the bicyclist. And you can see that all of the road and the staircase are pointing towards that subject, and therefore it is framed appropriately. In the same way, on the bottom, we want to see the lines of the photo and how they are progressing, moving in the same way that our subject is walking, and so that those really match one another. So think about the ways that lines can lead and also frame your photo. Also, shoot for your design. Make sure that you're leaving room for type. In the photo on the bottom left-hand side, you can see that the idea was really to show graphic or illustration on top of the design. You might also need to shoot the design to leave room for type or for text on the background. So be sure that you sketch out an idea of what your layout will look like and how the photo will play into that before you ever take your photo. This will allow you to properly compose your photo and do it yourself photography. Now, when we're talking about editing images, you don't have to be a Photoshop expert to know how to do very simple things within Photoshop. So, your textbook talks about cutout technique within Photoshop, and I'm sure a lot of you have never done something like this before. Well, if you're like me and you use Photoshop, a handful of times, you may not always remember how to do this. This is why using tutorials, either from Adobe or other content generators, can be very helpful. Here is a very quick tutorial on how to do cutout images within Photoshop.
Here's how to cut out an image in Photoshop CC. Go to File, Open, and open your image. Right-click on the Object Selection tool from the toolbar on the left. Select Quick Selection tool. Click the box for Sample All Layers if you're working with a composite image. You can also click Enhance Edge for a more precise edge selection. Click Select Subject in the upper toolbar. For less up-to-date Adobe Photoshop versions, you'll have to manually outline the subject in the foreground. Photoshop has multiple tools such as the Lasso tool, Marquee tool, and the Magic Wand tool for outlining your subject. If you would like to smooth the edge of the area you are cutting, click Select and Mask in the toolbar above your picture while your chosen area is selected but not yet cut out. Your selection will open in the new dialog box with options to refine, effect the edge detection, and multiple other options for tailoring your selection to your specific needs. Now that you have your area selected, you have a few options. Simply press Delete or Backspace on your keyboard if you want to remove this part of the photo entirely. If you like to use your selected area elsewhere, select Cut from the Edit menu. Open the image you like to put your cutout into, then select Paste from the Edit menu. You can also use the keyboard shortcut Command X for cutting and Command V for pasting.
So you can see that in just a few minutes, a minute 42, you can do something that seems very complicated, like cutting out an image. But I want you to know that it's okay to rely on tutorials for programs like Photoshop and Illustrator and InDesign. I do it all the time, and I've used the cutout technique, before they even had this unique tool that really does a lot of the work for you. I used to have to lasso, and cut out like that. But I still use tutorials just to remind me of the exact steps. So know that if you're coming across things within editing of images that you're not familiar with, go into a tutorial and follow along with it. Now, in terms of cropping images, we want to make sure that we're using good cropping techniques. The main rules of cropping is don't lose the context of the photo. If you crop in too closely, then you're really going to disconcert your viewer because they don't know where your subject is placed. Allow for enough context in your photograph that really helps tell the story. You also want to make sure to avoid what are called awkward amputations, where you're cutting off the crop in the middle of someone's arm, or, for example, in the bad crops of the model, you can see that we're first cutting off her feet. That looks really awkward. Like, where are her feet? Here we see that we're not supposed to see all of her legs in the second one, but we see too much of her legs in the bad crop. So we really don't want to cut off in any place where it leaves the audience feeling like you are amputating someone. Instead, use a crop to boost emotional appeal by putting the focus on the face. You really want any of your crop to make sure that the face and the subject, the product, becomes the primary subject of the photo. And you can also use cropping in case there is clutter within the photo that you need to eliminate. Now, again, this is not a Photoshop class. I don't really teach much in Photoshop, but these are some of the basic editing techniques that you need to be familiar with, such as editing and retouching a photo for brightness and contrast, color and saturation. You can extend the background by using a color picker tool or delete items using a spot heal or clone tool. Again, I've provided you with a tutorial on how to do these things, such as removing small objects from a photo, adding objects by cloning, and removing large objects. Um, I won't show you these particularly, but feel free to review these techniques with the tutorials on your own time. But these are some of the most common editing techniques within Photoshop and other photo editing programs that you should at least have some familiarity with when you're a designer. Now, in terms of using stock images, you want to make sure that you're using images that are non-exclusive. In other words, look at the communication tools from others within your market and make sure that they're not using the same stock images. When I worked at UAB Medicine, for instance, we would use Getty images like you see here. That was our subscription. And yet we would see stock images at Princeton or Brookwood hospitals that were also Getty images. And I needed to ensure that I wasn't using the same stock images that other competitors were. You also want to make sure that they're not too generic. So you don't want to use ones that look silly or don't look natural. I would argue that this man enjoying a dance class doesn't really look all that natural, right? And so make sure that you have ones that look good and that feel natural to your audience. And there are many, many bad stock images out there. So just make sure that you're using the right kind of stock for your design needs. You also want to make sure that you have the right to use the stock image. Just because an image can be downloaded doesn't mean that it is royalty free or that you have the right to use it. Make sure that you review where the photo came from. If it's part of a stock image collection, make sure that you have paid for the service or read the description and see if the photographer has asked for a courtesy. So make sure that you are using only photos that you have been granted access to so that you are not hit for copyright or plagiarism. And also watch for watermarks on your photographs. Many photographs will have things like Getty Images or Shutterstock watermarked on them. You don't want to use those in actual campaigns, although you could download the watermarked image and use it in a layout or design and see if that photo works well within that design before you actually go and purchase it. So that can be a cost saving measure for you. And also just be aware that sometimes famous people who are struggling for work will end up posing for stock images. So you wouldn't want to use this stock image, for example, because, you know, he's now famous in the Marvel universe and has a totally different connotation. So just make sure you're very aware of how you're using your stock images within your layout and design. So now that you understand a little bit more about using photography, make sure you watch part 2, which will go over how to use illustrations, then work on your discussion board for visuals, and read the chapters that are posted on basic layout prior to next week. If you have any questions, I'm always here for you. Feel free to email or reach out. Otherwise, I will see you in video 2.